Hello, good morning, and welcome to today's National All Hands for the Hydrographic Society of America. I want to welcome everybody here and just to inform you on some of how things are going to be going today. Just lay out some of our webinar format. So I would encourage everybody to, if you have a question, we will be holding all questions until the end of today's webinar. And so to log your question, I would ask that you use the questions tab here in the GoToMeeting screen, and you can send questions in that way, and then we will come back and answer those questions at the end of today's sessions. If you're having some sort of technical difficulty or have some other question that is not related to the content, feel free to use the chat window, and we have a team of THSOA people here behind the scenes who are helping me today, who will be monitoring that and seek to give you some help. So without any further ado, we'll get rolling here. So first off, I'm Rick Brennan. I'm the president of the Hydrographic Society, and I truly appreciate you taking some time out of your day to join us. I would like to introduce the officers here of the Hydrographic Society of America. So there's myself as the president, Harold Orlinsky, who is our longtime treasurer for the Hydrographic Society, and Haley Hollis, who is our secretary. And Haley is here behind the scenes helping me managing the chat windows in the presentations. We also have a board of trustees that you all elected this past year. So we've got Brian Connon, Tom Waddington, Kim Daly, and Starla Robinson. And Starla is also here helping work the behind the scenes of today's webinar. So I'd like to thank all the officers and board of trustees for their help this year. We've got off and started in January pretty aggressively and have been working. And today's webinar is really just to tell you a little bit about what we've been doing and where we're going. So first off, I know everybody's interested in what's going on with the U.S. Hydro Conference. So first off, I'd like to announce that the 2021 U.S. Hydro Conference is going to be in Wilmington, North Carolina. The current date for that, although this has not been entirely solidified yet, but the target date is going to be September 13th through the 17th. We have pushed that into the fall, obviously, because of the current COVID situation. Our hope being that by pushing it beyond next summer, that we might have a greater likelihood of holding an in-person conference for that, because we all believe that that is going to be the best and the most rewarding way for us to have that conference. We're planning on rotating those conferences around to the regions. So that one is currently in the Mid-Atlantic, and we'll be moving that to another chapter region for the next conference in 23. As you know, we alternate back and forth with our Canadian colleagues. And the new thing that we're going to be doing for this upcoming conference is we've selected a professional event coordinator to help us with the logistics in the planning and execution of this conference. And so that does a couple of things for us. So that takes a lot of just the general logistics of managing a conference off of our hands, and allows the board and the society itself to focus more on the content and the delivery, and ensuring that what we deliver to you, the members of the Hydrographic Society, is really the most valuable and impactful that we can do. And so that was a large part and factor in our decision to hire that event coordinator to support us for that. And interestingly, as it turns out, it is also the same event coordinator that plans and executes the Canadian Hydrographic Conference. So we're hoping that there will be some synergies between those, and that we'll each be able to help improve and raise the quality of the conferences, as we continue to move forward. So we're very encouraged by that. So the one thing I wanted to talk to you a little bit about today is just to give you a direction on where the society has been going. I don't think this is an entirely new direction, but we felt like it was good to start to codify it and solidify it, and also share it with you, the members. The primary objective of the Hydrographic Society, as we state in our very own bylaws, is the advancement of the science of surveying at sea and related sciences. So since the practice of hydrography is not recognized as a standalone profession in many of the states, in many states it's incorporated under a profession of land surveying, which requires experience in boundary surveying. It's difficult for hydrographers to advance in the practice, in private practice, without a state-specific land survey license. So the National Council of Examiners for Engineering and Surveying recently started the pursuit of modular licensing, which includes mapping science that is defined as topographic mapping and control standards, hydrographic and remote sensing equipment, measurements using photographic methods, measurements using LiDAR, and digital laser scanning, etc. So THSOA will seek to provide the foundation and support necessary to create two paths towards professional recognition for hydrographers, consisting of certification by the International Hydrographic Organization and professional licensure by the states, with a licensure focus on the 30 states which border our coasts and Great Lakes. So the strategy to achieve all of that is what I've got outlined here. So what we would like to be able to do is to raise the standards of the existing THSOA NSPS, which is the National Society of Professional Surveyors hydrographic certification program, to meet international standards and attain International Hydrographic Organization recognition for certification. And that work is underway, and John Dassler will be presenting to us today on those efforts. We're also working to develop a continuing education program and a system of continuing education units to track each certified hydrographer's attainment of the necessary training required for that. We also need to form an alliance with other geospatial societies to broaden the community's base to support licensing and testing scheme within the NCEES mapping science licensure. So they typically require about 1,000 people to take that test a year to support that. And so we really need a much broader coalition of people to do that. And so our forming alliances with other geospatial societies like MAPS, who we've already reached out to, is going to be critical to making that work. We also need to provide NCEES subject matter experts to draft questions for the mapping science module exam, particularly in hydrography. And also the final element of our plan is to seek recognition from each of the 30 coastal and Great Lakes states for mapping science licenses within their state. So that's a lot of work. I don't see that happening in the next year. I think this is going to be a long game that we're playing here, but I think we've seen around the country that the push to get licensing for hydrographic surveying is something that is of concern to everyone, and we'll be taking the pulse on that here a little bit later this morning. So the next thing I wanted to brief you on, I think if you were at the last U.S. Hydro Conference, you realize that there was quite a bit of talk about updating the bylaws. That update needs to occur by vote, and we need to get a majority of the members of the Hydrographic Society to weigh in on that. And so I'm going to brief you here on that, and we will be following up later with a vote that you should get via email through your membership account. And so the primary change that we were seeking to make was that we would have a president-elect selected. And so there were, I believe there are 4 or 5 different locations where the bylaws would be updated. And so the one that you see, section 6.1 in the bylaws is what's in red here. So a non-voting president-elect shall also be elected for terms commencing an odd number of years, who shall assume the office of president in the following even-numbered years for a term of 2 years. So that is what we are pushing forward as a recommendation, and we're seeking votes on that. We've gotten a number of comments about other changes to the bylaws, and we are fully cognizant of those, but this is what this current board believes is the most critical. And I think the biggest value in this is that the president-elect would actually have the opportunity to be on board and be present for the planning of the next hydrographic conference, so that as they came on board as president, they would not be starting cold in planning the next conference, which is one of the biggest events that we do. So it allows there to be a certain amount of continuity and an overlap in that, which is clearly valuable. So the second location was in section 6.1. As you see here in red, the president-elect assumes this office after serving 1 year as a non-voting member of the Board of Trustees. The following was in section 7.1. The president-elect shall serve as a non-voting member for the year prior to assumption of the presidency. And then finally, it just says that this is how it just changes president to president-elect as far as the updates on that. So that's in general how the changes that we just showed in red here are what we are proposing to make. In the next month or so, you should be getting notification of that vote, and we'll tally the scores and see what we think about that, and certainly we'll take questions on that at the end of today's session. But I felt it was important to at least give you some background for that, so that you weren't getting that vote in your mailbox cold and not aware of what that was about. So with that, I think we'll shift to a poll, and I'd like to have that poll put up, and then we will switch to our first technical presentation. So thank you. All right, we're going to be closing the polls here shortly. It looks like we've got about 82% who voted. If you haven't voted on or put your response on the poll, please go ahead, and we'll be closing it here shortly. Great. Thank you for taking the time to register your poll today. And I would like to introduce John Dassler, and he is going to talk to us today about his work as the president of the NSPS Hydrographer Certification Board and what that board has been doing to advance the certification protocol. So John, take it away.
Great. Thank you, Rick. See if I can advance the next slide. There we go. So Rick kind of gave a general overview of what we're going on. So a little bit of history here. So the Hydrographic Society of America established a working group back in 2016 to advance the U.S. hydrographic program to consider requirements aligned with professional licensure and also gain international recognition through IHO and the Federation of Surveyors, similar to what the Canadian and Australasian hydrographic programs are. And out of that came a white paper that was developed with recommendations for 2 levels of certification. So in 2019, back at the annual meeting at the Board of Trustees in Biloxi at the conference, established a committee. I was appointed chair of that committee to advance the efforts for the following objectives. One was to research the requirements for IHO, FIG, ICA hydrographer certification program in the US that would have an international recognition. Second was the pursuit of avenues for professional licensure for hydrographies and topographic surveying through state licensing board that would eliminate the requirements for boundary surveying experience. So in many states, that's a requirement, and one of the restrictions is boundary surveying experience. So members of the NSPS THSOA Hydrographer Certification Board have been actively pursuing professional mapping science licensure through NCEES and state licensing boards. So at NCEES, August 2019, at a survey forum, there was a survey module task force motion that was presented and passed by member states. So the NCEES is consistent of state licensing board members. So this was at their annual meeting, and they voted to support modular exams. So breaking up licensing into different modules that NCEES would offer the exams for states. So of those, there would be core professional surveying required for all disciplines, boundary surveying, the public land survey system, mapping science, and a drainage design were the main modules that they were talking about. So out of the mapping science licensure, Rick kind of touched on this. It includes topographic mapping and control standards, hydrographic and remote sensing equipment, measurements using photogrammetric methods, measurements using LIDAR, and then terrestrial and mobile laser scanning, et cetera, sort of the gamut for hydrographic and topographic surveying. And when we met with them a few years ago, the concern is the number of people that they would like to see for licensing. So they were hoping in the order of 700 per year. I mean, currently right now through our program, we license about a dozen people a year. So joining the larger community to that end is going to help. So as I mentioned earlier, sort of the pros to this approach, it potentially removes the barrier of boundary survey education and experience. So with many individuals, they have a good background in geodesy and topographic mapping, but don't have boundary experience, and that can be a barrier to a state license. National standard exams accepted by state licensing boards this will simplify mobility. So currently you have to get licensed in every state, but since these exams would be offered at a national level through NCEES, it'll make it easier as states adopt this to get licensed from state to state. The mapping science exam development will include subject matter experts in the field of hydrography. So they told they would like to reach out to the hydrographic community and have a subject matter expert that will help in generating those exams. Cons is that this is going to take some time, as Rick mentioned. One is that it takes several years and requires a minimum of 10 states to adopt the program. Adoption will be state by state and require state legislators to alter and develop statutes to adopt the modular licensure. So again, it's gonna take some time. Applicants will need to develop a knowledge base with a wider range of mapping sciences than currently just through hydrography. So holding a degree in related field of geomatics, pass the NCEES Fundamentals of Surveying exam, and pass a core professional survey exam. So there'll be a minimum number of questions on the modular license on hydrography. So we still see there's probably a required differentiator as there is now, which is why the NSPS and back then ASPS started the hydrographer certification program to kind of differentiate land surveyors from those that know more about hydrography. So we have a number of proactive initiatives. So this committee is actively tracking the development with NCEES. We've developed an outreach program to state licensing boards and have been doing some presentations at surveying conferences and doing a presentation at some of the boards, state licensing boards, to adopt modular licensure and kind of state our case for the need to have hydrography a portion of that. And current hydrographic academic programs, we're doing outreach efforts with them to really consider prepping students for the Fundamentals of Surveying exam. So like with geomatics programs in engineering, typically in those undergraduate years, as in your senior year, you're prepping to take that fundamentals exam, which gets you on the path to professional licensure. So we feel also that the hydrographic program should start considering this as well. So here's where we are. As we mentioned, we're pursuing two different levels of certification. So level 2 is the certified hydrographer program. So there's qualifications for that. If you've gone through a IHO Cat A program, then there's no additional educational requirements. There's some educational requirements if you haven't gone through that program, and we'll be putting together a document that gets submitted to IHO. But these 2 levels and these steps to work through the process, this flow chart, is kind of aligned with the Canadian hydrographic program, or the Canadian certification program. We had some meetings with them at the Canadian conference this last winter. And then it'll require about, again, as we have now, 60 months of experience, 24 months in the field and 24 months in technical charge, similar to the way it is now. One thing it does add, which is a requirement to be considered for IHO, is having a logbook of your hydrographic surveying experience, and then submit an abstract of what you're going to propose for a project report, and then have 4 references. And then the board would review the logbook and abstract of the report. And if that abstract is approved, then you'd submit the report. That goes on, gets approved by the board, and then there'd be an exam. Successfully passed the hydrographer exam would be a level 2. Level 1 is kind of a higher level. Again, both the Canadian and Australasian programs have these levels, and this came out of that white paper that was suggested by the THSOA working group to that end. So this has a little higher educational requirements and additional coursework, again, defined in some of the notes that we'll have to these flow charts and defined in a manual that we're working on now. And then 48 months. So this is kind of more aligned with the state licensure. Probably the key differentiator here is successfully passing the Fundamentals of Surveying exam, which will be required by the state licensure program. Same concept of a logbook, abstract of the paper. So that process is pretty much the same. and then there'll be an exam that's a little more advanced for the hydrographer certification program. This won't get you the state licensure part, but you'll have that, and you'd be recognized under this program as a level 1 certified master hydrographer. So that's the general overview, kind of where we are right now. We're just fine tuning these flow charts. We're working on a manual and hope to have a submittal to IHO by the end of the year to start moving this forward. The state licensure program, I mean, is on a longer track. That's going to take some time, but NCEES, I mean, that we're kind of at the mercy of NCEES and putting that together. But what we're trying to do is have a system that kind of aligns and fits into that to help people advance their profession in hydrography, right? So state licensure, I guess just kind of another thought on that. It's really only required if you're running a private practice, unless there's some government requirements. Typically academic community and people working for the federal government are exempt for the state licensure, but many coastal states have hydrographic surveying you have to have a professional land survey license, and in some cases, the professional engineer's license is also acceptable to practice in that state. And the barrier to that, and we've seen this a lot, is people just don't have boundary experience. They may have all the other qualifications, but that can be a barrier. So we're trying to find a way to where our profession can be recognized on state licensure without this barrier of having experience with boundary surveying. So that's all I have, Captain. So if there's questions, I guess just some general information. This is the link to the Hydrographer Certification Board, our page. The administrator is Trish Milburn, her email address, and then I'm the chair of the certification board.
Great.
Thank you.
Well, thank you, John. I appreciate your time today in presenting that. And if anyone has any questions, you can send either John or Tricia Milburn an email to get further information about that certification program. And there was also a question asked in the question window on that, and I put the link to the NSPS page there that allows you to download the application, et cetera, on that. So I guess at this point, I'd like to ask that we put up our second poll. You should have a poll. We'll give you about 2 minutes to answer this, and then we'll be switching to our next technical presentation. Okay, about 30 seconds left. If you haven't answered the poll, please go ahead and make a selection, and then we will be moving on to our second panelist and technical presentation. That's really interesting. Looks like we're about 50% split on that on continuing education, but looks like it's relevant for most everybody. That's good to hear. So I'd like to introduce our next panelist, Andy Meacham from Meacham Industries, who has recently purchased Klein Sonar, so a long-standing pillar in the hydrographic community, and so he's going to present for us today on some new sonar technology that Klein has produced. So Andy, please take it away.
Thanks, Rick. First of all, I appreciate everybody's time, and also thank you to Rick and the rest of the THS team for the organization here. It's very impressive. So hopefully I can control the presentation here. Yeah, okay. So before I get started, I think you guys have the dubious honor of being the first presentation as Mind Technology. Up until Monday this week, we were Meacham Industries. As of Monday, we are now Mind Technology. It's a big rebranding process. We passed our shareholder vote, and so I now have to remember to say Mind Technology instead of Meacham, whereas for the past 6 to 7 weeks, even more, I've been trying to must say Meacham instead of Mind. So if I switch between the two, please forgive me. As Rick said, Meacham or Mind are the corporate parents of Klein. We purchased Klein 3 to 4 years ago, I think, and as a wholly owned subsidiary of Mind. I'm the Chief Technology Officer for Mind Technology, and the paper is put together, or the presentation is put together by me and by Peter Runciman, who's the CTO at Klein, with significant input from Pete Ramsey, who works for Mind as our Strategic Director for Hydrographic Programs. And I think that Pete's known to a lot of you. So the title of the presentation, not a very sort of snappy one, filling the sonar nadir gap using angle look sonar, ALS, in conventional towed systems and unmanned underwater vehicles. My alternative title is Skunk Stripes Suck and Contrast is Key. And hopefully we'll go through here and I'll tell you a little bit about what we're going to talk about. I'll talk briefly about why there is a gap, what else that gap, that geometry means for the sonar, for the surveyor, what that means in practical terms for the hydrographer and for the end user, what our solution that we've come up with is and how that works, give you a few examples on real world examples of that data, come up with some conclusions, and I've put a thing in here for questions, but as Rick says, please use the chat window to submit any questions, and I'll come back to them at the end with Rick and John. So these first few slides here, I'm going to rattle through these pretty quickly because you guys almost certainly know significantly better than me about this. So I've got a very brief cartoon here about why there's a gap, and I think we've all seen side scan sonar, and it's characterized by that skunk stripe down the middle of the screen, and it's a simple geometry issue. And I've got a simple cartoon here, some gross simplification, but you can see that because of the geometry of the sonars, there's a gap in the middle that doesn't get covered, and that's the classic skunk stripe. And we all know it and do not love it. But one of the other things that is important is that not only is there a gap in the middle because of the geometry of the situation, at ranges close to the nadir, the position of the sonar means that we're looking sort of almost directly above it, and so that we get a much lower contrast in the imagery. And we've all seen this when we're looking at side scan sonar surveys, that objects close to the nadir have lower contrast and lower shadow and are much more difficult to detect and or characterize. And so I've put together a little render here, and I think this is just explaining this, and I think you all will understand this picture. Two exactly identical objects, one next to the nadir, one further away, and you can see that on the further object there's a longer shadow, and that means that in the plan view, which is at the top there, it's much easier to detect that object and or notice that it's a thing that's standing proud off of the seabed. This is nothing new to all of you. So what does that mean to the end user with this concept of the gap in the middle and the poor contrast? There is still a significant requirement within the industry for the standard single beam echo sounder and side scan sonar survey. It's still required by lots of agencies, and there are many requirements out there for it. Water obstruction and navigation surveying, engineering and post-engineering surveys. And traditionally, that that configuration with the side scan and the single beam echo sounder, with a standard 200 kilohertz single beam echo sounder, the footprint has got a diameter of about 0.5 meter. And this is some data that Pete Ramsey was kind enough to drag out from his archives. It's using an old Klein 3000 sonar. He took the data off the coast of Australia a few years back, flying at 10 meters above the seabed. And that gives you, with the vessels at 10 meters and the sonars at 7.5 meters. And so we have a 7.5 meter nadir gap. And you can see there to scale the footprint of a standard 200 kilohertz single beam echo sounder. I think that it's very clear, even if you didn't know before, you certainly would from here, that there is no way that you could say that echo sounder covers that gap. I mean, it's just a drop in the ocean. And the positioning of that dot on the screen is not arbitrary. You can see that just to the sides of that dot, there's a little sort of deviation in the side of the skunk strap there, and that's because there's an object that's standing proud off the seabed, and we're seeing that a little bit better in the nadir than the seabed. But I think it would be very hard to make any kind of detection on that or any kind of classification on that. And I think more importantly, there could be any one of a number of other similar sized objects of hydrographic interest and of mine warfare type interest, or any other sort of underwater survey interest within that nadir gap, which we simply wouldn't see. And this is a common problem. And the solution that is normally applied is that you have to go over the track line again with something like a 40% offset to make sure that you then cover that nadir gap on the next pass round. Which, you know, that's how things have been done, but it's not a very efficient method of operating, because you are certainly overlapping areas where you've already been, and you may well have perfectly good data in those areas, but you're going over them again and effectively either wasting time or confusing the issue, and it just takes significantly longer than you would want. So having to sort of describe the problem very quickly, what I'll describe now is our Klein's solution to that problem, or we at least think it's a solution, and how we can make that process a little more efficient and also give you some better quality data in that nadir region. So we came up with this concept. It's been around internally for a few years, and we spent a lot of time in R&D, and we launched it initially about 18 months ago, and it's what we call ALS, or angle look sonar. And our first product we launched it on was the MaxView 600, the tow side scan. But essentially what ALS is it's, as you might expect from a side scan sonar company, it's a reconfigured side scan. Crucially, in this case, instead of having the arrays mounted to the side of the platform, they're actually mounted out and forward slightly away from the platform, so that in this case the beams from those, what we call them whiskers in the towfish case here, instead of pointing straight out as the normal side scan would, they actually point forward and down. So you form the sort of X-shaped coverage pattern in front of the vehicle, which sweeps the seabed ahead of it. And we take that data we gather from those X-shaped patterns. They arrive, they look sort of like a V as we get them, like arrows, and we then reshuffle those to form standard horizontal lines that fit with the swath that we gather from the side scan. And so we can reorder those to make a complete coverage of the nadir, and so that we, first of all, we eliminate that gap. But one of the key points with this is that not only do we cover the nadir, but we also cover it with good high contrast data. And that's a critical point, that it would be, I guess, a little beneficial, I suppose, if we were covering the nadir with some downward looking sonar that you'd have some coverage, but you'd have really poor contrast. And in this case, because of the way that the system is organized and because of the geometry, it means that we have good high contrast data in that nadir region. But also, more importantly, perhaps, there is an overlap between the ALS, the nadir filler, and the regular side scan, so that the ALS crosses into the nadir region of the regular side scan. It means we can overlay the high contrast data from the ALS onto the low contrast near nadir side scan data, which means that not only do we fill the gap, but we fill the gap with high contrast data, and more, we fill the low contrast areas of the side scan with high contrast data. And so again, there's another sort of render here that shows that. I think makes it quite clear. I mean, I've repeated the previous image of the classic side scan with the two objects, and you can see one well and one not so well. One with a long shadow, one with a short shadow. But you can see on the ALS version of the same image, that object is in exactly the same place, that even though it's close to the nadir of the side scan, because of the way that the ALS works and it looks forward and down, you're getting high contrast data on that close target, even though you wouldn't see the high contrast data in the side scan. And we can overlay that and fuse that data together to provide a full swath coverage with good quality data throughout. But and I think we all agree that that's great. I mean, that's really useful, that we're covering the gap, we're getting high contrast data. But one of the other features, and the astute amongst you will have noticed, that in the ALS image in the previous slide, the shadow from that target actually did not project in the same direction that you would expect from a regular side scan. Actually projected at a 45-degree angle. And this wasn't really something that we had initially thought of as a particular advantage. We knew it would be there, but we didn't really kind of think at any depth about what it would mean. And as the product developed over the last 4 or 5 years, we realized that this was actually a really powerful additional technique. And in my opinion, I think this is going to be equally useful for the system, or equally powerful than the gap filling and the high contrast, is that we get these multiple looks, or what we call in-stride multi-look of the target. And I spoke a little bit earlier about classification and contrast, and certainly as operators we use that contrast to detect something. But more and more, that sort of initial cut, that first level contrast, is being handled by an ATR system or CAD, CAC, depends on where you're from, what you call it. And for those, the shadow length is absolutely one of the key defining factors for it. And so if we have a situation now where we're getting multiple looks at a target as we go along and multiple shadows, then that means that the ATR or the operator has twice as many chances to be able to identify it. And so hopefully I've put another couple of renders in here which will maybe illustrate that. So in this case, we've got the same situation as before, but also below that we put 2 donuts or car tires in the scene instead. And you can see on the right hand image there that you can just about tell the difference, but only because they're next to each other. I mean, I would challenge anybody to look at those images in isolation and be able to tell exactly which one was which. When you put them next to each other, you can probably tell, but without that contextual information. It's very difficult. If I now show you what the ALS image looks like of that situation, you can see that rather than just having the same square or rectangular thing with a small shadow, not only do we see the shape of the object in the shadow, we actually even see that there's a hole in it. And I'll freely confess that this is obviously a cherry-picked example I've used here, where the geometry is exactly right to show the ALS off to the maximum effect. But that is for the purpose of presentation. But in reality, this is a real thing. This is that it's likely that you wouldn't have the exact unfortunate coincidence where the object is perfectly 90 degrees onto the sonar and you wouldn't see it at all. But it illustrates the concept really well, that because you've got those two looks, where with just one look you might not be able to understand what the structure is, whether it's something that's standing proud or not, and particularly in the nadir where there's poor contrast. With these multiple looks and long range high contrast imagery, it means that as you go along, you're getting a whole wealth of additional information in the scene, because we have these multiple sensors in there, and also because they are not configured in the same way as each other, that you would never have got without this capability. And so, having spoken about it in terms of sort of pretty pictures and renders and things, it's probably wise that I actually show you some real data. So this is some data we gathered on a trial in Europe towards the end of last year, and the data you see on the left-hand side there, that's just the ALS data. It doesn't have any side scan data associated with it in this example. And you can see there are two targets. Number one, we are told it's actually a torpedo, an exercise torpedo standing proud of the seabed. And you see that there you've got a nice, really good quality image of that torpedo and really good shadow. And this is sort of 6.5, 7 meters from the nadir. So it would be certainly well within that sort of area where our contrast would be poor. Now, in that first case, we would almost certainly have seen it in the side scan. It's not in the skunk stripe, but we would not have got that quality of shadow. We would not have got that quality of imagery, and it would have been much more difficult to classify. The second object is a very small mine-like object standing slightly off the seabed, which, it's a small, very small target, but we see in the nadir we've got some target resolution and a good shadow. In that case, we would not have seen anything of that object. It's less than 2 meters from the nadir. And so we would have absolutely sailed straight across that object without seeing it at all. We would not have known it was there. We would have to have done another pass to even know it was there. It's the sort of the classic unknown unknowns. We didn't even know that we didn't know it was there. So I mean, that's sort of, there's some good examples of just the ALS data there. Moving forward, this is sort of a bit of a zoom in on the ALS data. I know that there was initially some skepticism from people, and also even internally, as to this strange 45-degree configuration. Is this going to give good quality data? Well, I think the answer is yes. So on the left, we've got this, the standard side scan. Is actually our new 600 kilohertz focus side scan. It's really nice, but this is in the nadir and it's slant range corrected. So you get that standard sort of blurring in the nadir, and you can certainly see there's an object there. There's no doubt about that. But it'd be very hard to work out what it is, and you've got very poor shadow contrast there. There's certainly a lot of distortion that's gone on because of the nadir effects. Now, and this is gathered in exactly the same pass with the ALS. You can see with the ALS sonar, you've got very, very good resolution, excellent shadow at the slightly different angles. So as you saw with the previous one, because of the geometry of the target there, you might not necessarily have seen that shadow very well, even if you pass over it at 20 meters range. But because the ALS has a different look, you see the shadow really clearly, and you can see the structure. The lines are straight, The shadows are clean, and you can see the sand ripples there. And again, that shows very clearly how the shadows go off at a slightly different angle, and those sand ripples, which we don't see in the side scan because of their geometry, are very clear in the ALS. And so this, with this capability, it allows us to start doing some really sort of interesting, clever things. So this is some data we gathered off the coast of Portsmouth, New Hampshire, again last year, and you can see that we've got this bottom feature. I'm sure that the hydrographers and geologists amongst you will tell me exactly what the geological basis of it is. It looks like a big kind of teardrop or swirl there, and we've got the ALS data on the other side there that fills that gap quite nicely. But when we've got that high contrast data and we've got the coverage, it means that we can do things like this and actually fuse that image together. This has been manually fused by me after the fact. We are currently working on an automated fusion technique that's due to come out sometime towards the end of the year. And we've also worked with some of the third-party mosaicing companies to look at how to mosaic this data most efficiently. And here we've got full swath imagery, and you see that the sand ripples are contiguous. There's a slight discrepancy in the display gain there. That's a feature of the fact that it was gathered in the two windows, and I just manually fused it. In our automated fusion, those display gains are normalized, so you don't have quite such an abrupt change. And you have this situation where the shadows change direction, which is a little odd. It takes a little bit of time to get used to, but you can see that you've got full swath imagery with high contrast and good shadow across the whole of the range. There's no skunk stripe, there's no gap, there's no lousy quality data at close range. So I guess in conclusion, and I'm aware that I've rattled through this pretty quickly, we've got a fairly short time window here. What does this offer? Well, first of all, it fills the gap, and this is the sort of the headline feature. It fills the gap, which is great. But the second feature, which is not necessarily clear unless you really know side scan and know sonar, is that not only does it fill the gap, it fills the gap with high contrast data, and because of the overlap, provides high contrast data in areas of the side scan where the contrast was low. And so just based on those two factors alone, it can offer a 40% reduction in survey time. But the fourth point, and this is one that is particularly close to my heart, as I'm sure you can tell, is that you get this in-stride multi-look capability where you massively increase the probability of correct classification, particularly in the case of a situation where you're using some kind of ATR or ATD. They are almost universally cued based on shadow sizes and shadow geometries compared to highlights. And when you give that ATR or ATD 2 hits on the same target simultaneously, then the probability of correct classification really massively increases. It really has a significant measurable increase in probability of correct classification, because the ATR is often trained with sort of a neural network, are used to a certain shadow geometry, and you may not have that shadow geometry because of the way that the target is lying in the first pass. But with the 45-degree pass, then you are guaranteed to get that correct geometry between them or in either of them. And so it's really quite a significant advantage that we hadn't initially considered, but as we developed this process and this concept, we realized very quickly that this was going to be a very powerful additional tool. So thank you for that. I know I rattled through very quickly. Hopefully I kept under my 15 minutes. I know that my initial presentation had about 3 times as many slides, and Rick was very diplomatic and said, you've got 15 minutes and 40 slides. That's going to be a challenge. And I've cut down, but obviously I have plenty more data, and I'm more than happy to talk to any of you about it, either through the panel here or offline. I've put my contact details hopefully at the end here. Get to advance. Yep, there we go. So there's my contact details and Pete Ramsey, though I'm sure most of you know Pete anyway, and Peter Runciman's. And so apropos of my earlier statement, we still have our Mitcham Industries emails there. Those emails are changing, but for the foreseeable future, the old emails will work anyway. So they'll still work for you to get in contact with us if you have any other questions. And I will also hasten to add that I am not the sales guy, so I don't know how much things cost. I'm the technology guy, and so I'm told that they're very competitively priced and absolutely great value for money. But anything more than that, I'd have to hand you over to the real sales guys, and they'll talk turkey with you. Okay, thank you very much, Rick. I really appreciate the time, and I really appreciate everybody else's time to listen.
Thank you, Andy. That was great. I really appreciate you taking the time to give us that presentation today. So we've got one more poll, and then we're going to move into our question and answer session. So I'll give you all a little bit of time to answer this one, and then we will come back immediately after that. So as we continue to finish up the poll here, I guess I would ask if anybody has any questions that haven't registered them in the questions window, to please go ahead and enter those in now, and we will seek to answer those here as we move into our Q&A session. Okay, well, that's pretty interesting. I know that certainly for my day job, it is the thing that has changed is I am certainly not commuting any longer and working entirely out of my basement for the last several months. So I'm glad to see that that there's at least a few people who hasn't changed their jobs at all. Okay, so let's move on to our Q&A session then. We've had a couple of questions that have come in over the presentation, and let me see. This is great. We've had quite a few stream in here.
So it seems as if most of our questions are certification based, but I do see one for Adam. He said the talk was very interesting, but it looks like the swath width on the ALS isn't very wide. Why would a user not just switch to using a multi-beam echo sounder?
Andy, would you like to answer that?
If he's there. Ooh.
Andy, it looks like you're
Yeah, it's a good question. So absolutely, you could use a multi-beam for at this point, and the swath width is deliberately narrow because of the geometry of the arrays. It's at a higher frequency as well than the 600 kilohertz. It's at centered around 850 kilohertz. So you absolutely could use a multi-beam at that point. The reason why that might not be appropriate is that you might not have a multi-beam. They're expensive and difficult, and they need a whole other skill set to operate. But from my personal background as a data scientist and a sonar developer, the difference between the data from a multi-beam and a sonar, as far as something like an ATR is concerned, they are very, very different data. So you could absolutely use a multi-beam, and if you were looking to use an ATR type approach to make even just initial detections for manual evaluation afterwards, you would need to have a separate ATR that was trained on multi-beam data. The advantage of using the ALS is that the sonar data, it looks effectively the same to the ATR. It comes in at these sort of these V's, which look a little bit odd to us as human operators because the shadows are at a slightly weird angle. But actually, the way we present that data to the ATR is just as a whole series of single beams, and so it looks exactly the same to the ATR as the regular sonar does. And so that's we think is one of the big advantages, is that you don't need a separate ATR model. You don't need to train a whole new ATR on this data. It will work with your existing ATR. That was one of the sort of the key requirements we put out to ourselves, is that we don't want it to be completely different. Because yeah, absolutely, you could use a multi-beam if you were flying very low and had really good, clear sort of Caribbean waters. Wouldn't that be marvelous? You could use a LiDAR or a camera. But as we know, the problem with the LiDARs and cameras is that anything more than about 4 or 5 meters and any level of turbidity, then they don't work so well. But yeah, and there's no doubt a multi-beam would meet the same requirements. This does it in an integrated, lower cost manner that means that the interpretation is the same skill set as for the sonar.
Thank you, Andy. So I know we've got a number of questions here about the licensure and certification. So John, if maybe you could join me here. I know we had one from Nick Townley. It looks like Nick may have left the meeting. I'm not sure, but it says, for certification, where there will also be a pathway for existing IHO recognized surveyors, or still just the NSPS exam. I note that there's an existing clause that can waive this, but unsure if actually used. This would need clarification under the new model. John, would you like to address that?
John, you're still muted.
John, it looks like you're, oh, there you go. You should be on now.
There we go. Yeah, I thought I was muted by you guys. Okay. Yeah, so obviously all of these programs have guidelines, and there are going to be exceptions that we look on that. So if somebody has already not only, and I guess what they were asking was, if I have gone through a Cat A academic program and am now a Cat A hydrographer, that's a little different. Actually, you're already accepted as a Cat A hydrographer in that case. This program isn't exactly aligned with Cat A. I think one of the caveats in the Canadian program is the same way. You don't get it. Can't call yourself a Cat A hydrographer unless you've met all of those requirements underneath these. So this is a slightly different program, and certainly would look at everybody's experience. So some of those details are still being ironed out and will be put together in the handout manual that we're working on.
And I think, John, it's fair to say too, right? I mean, I think a lot of the requirements that we're trying to meet is to simultaneously raise the caliber of the certification program and start moving us towards something that would meet the state license requirements and NCEES, which is basically administered by NCEES. And so that's the direction that we're going. So there were a couple of questions, particularly about Canada and licensing in both Canada and the UK. And so I think the challenges that we are trying to solve with this program are uniquely focused on meeting the needs of licensing here in the U.S., which is certainly a situation that is managed independently by each of the various states. So it's there is not a central program for managing that, which makes our situation uniquely complex, I think. Would you agree, John?
Yeah, and I think one of the other things in the whole movement to expand on our current program is, so state licensing boards just look at this as a recognition of your peers, a certification. It's not licensure. They don't recognize those kinds of things. And then also over the years, we've been trying to advance this more to sort of an IHO standards of competence for hydrographers, sort of the S5, and having continuing education. So the current program just doesn't meet those requirements, and so we're trying to make this a little more robust, where it meets not only the IHO level, but what it's required to have a professional licensure. So it's going to make it easier to transition into that professional license. So continuing education, educational requirements, and a lot of the things that are under S5, under the IHO document for the standards of competence for hydrographies, we're trying to incorporate to really beef up the program more.
Yep, and to answer Denny Haynes' question, I think we actually have somebody on the board who has a Canadian certification, isn't that right, John? And so we have looked in depth at the Canadian program and the Australasian program, and so I think we've certainly modeled it, bits and pieces of it off of both of those. Correct?
Correct. Yeah. Yeah. Ben, he's not certified yet. He's going through the process, but he's I think actively involved with the board up there, and we've certainly had a lot of. He's kind of served as our liaison with the Canadian board, and as they work through that system. So we're kind of modeling it more towards the Canadian program in our connections there.
Okay. There's a couple of questions about folks that are not American or Canadian based. Can they participate in any of the certification programs?
Yes. I think we've had people from not U.S. nationals that have been involved. In fact, recently, I think we had a request in South America about doing it. The only requirement is you would need to take the exams in the U.S. You'd have to travel to the U.S. We won't proctor exams outside the U.S.
Okay. Have we thought through the impact or confusion on the offshore oil and gas renewables survey industry with a narrow interpretation of hydrographic survey? Many of the surveys in the offshore oil and gas renewable business would term themselves as a hydrographic surveyor, but they've never collected an MBES data set. Very capable people with a different focus in the hydrographic sector. Did you catch that? That was a lot.
Yeah, I guess what I would say, well, I would hope that industry would sort of align with the IHO standards. I mean, certainly there's a lot of geophysics. There's a lot of other things that are acquired on the renewable energies, like wind siting, as I assume what they're going towards. But we're really trying to align with the IHO requirements, S5, to that end. So nobody can really call themselves even like a Cat A hydrographer unless they've gone through that process and have done that. We're kind of more aligned with that, I guess. I mean, I think the term hydrography is thrown around a lot. I mean, a lot of people just coming out of programs that don't really have much in the way of geomatics or other experience. They've just been sort of been offshore geology mapping, right? And so right now that term is pretty broadly used, I guess. And so we're I guess trying to refine that, not kind of more to a certification process, right?
Okay. So is there a current understanding of how many registered land surveyors or professional engineers in the USA who are also competent and certified hydrographers?
Yeah, I don't know if we have an exact number there. That's always been a large debate. And, you know, I think way back when the ACSM program got started, so the Corps of Engineers had always required under their contract to have a land survey license to do hydrographic surveys for the Corps of Engineers. I mean, you're doing volume calculations and there's other things underneath their hydrographic survey contract. So what they soon learned that just because you're a professional land surveyor doesn't mean you know hydrography. And so that whole certification program really came out as a differentiator that the Corps of Engineers used. In fact, NOAA uses that now. So it can't be used as a sole selection. It can just be used as a differentiator. But yeah, certainly there are surveyors out there practicing hydrography that maybe shouldn't, and it kind of does violate, as you get professional licensure, you're required to not practice outside your area of expertise, and you could use your license because of that. So certainly there are some cases where that does happen, and I think that's why it's more important to get this better defined and have a program and make a path for the hydrographic community to pursue professional licensure where they don't have to get into the surveying. We tried to do this hydrography alone. We just don't have the mass to do that, right? That's why aligning with photogrammetry and topographic and mobile topographic, I mean, the blur between what's mapping on the coasts and oceans and the shorelines is becoming less blurred, right? So people are collecting airborne LiDAR and merged topo and bathymetric LiDAR. Vessels are acquiring mobile laser scanning using GPS and inertial systems and bathymetry. So the technologies are kind of merging together, which I think makes this a good time to kind of to bring that into a more holistic program of not just hydrography, but merging with topography and gaining those masses, I guess.
Rick, a quick question for you. Has there been any progress on the educational committee and national scholarships for 2020, 2021?
Yep, we have met with members of the education board, and we're currently looking at organizing the various committees right now, because having a conference planning committee or having a conference planner help us with the conference takes away a lot of what had been traditional committee roles, and so those are going to need to be redone. The education committee has been starting to meet. Chris Freeman had been the head of the student outreach, and I think he is asked to potentially step back from that. So that is all currently in play right now, and so we're trying to reinvigorate those. So the Hydrographic Society board has been meeting on the second and fourth Thursday of every month, and now that we've kind of got the what we feel to be the conference challenge solved, we are moving towards having that fourth Thursday of each month used specifically for meeting with the various committees and getting those re-energized and moving. So Melissa, thank you for the question, and stay tuned for more on that.
Okay. Oop, I'm sorry, new questions keep coming in and I'm losing my spot.
Yeah, so I think Mike Nitska also had a question I see, and his is related to Starla, so maybe I can answer both of those. So Starla asked if we'll be seeking THSOA nominations for president-elect in the coming year. And then Mike asked about the issue of having a tie in the voting solved. The bylaw changes that we are seeking, Mike, are just specifically for the ones that we outlined today, so that we can actually start to move forward with getting a president-elect on board and having that person there to see the whole process of the conference and the planning portion of that, so that they've got that experience under their belt. So we know that there are a number of additional bylaws that need to be adjudicated. And so at this point, we're just trying to establish a procedure for how we do that. And this survey and vote software that we're currently using is going to be the way that we're going to try to move that forward. So for everyone else's edification on this, the problem with getting these bylaws approved has been the challenge of needing to have a quorum, and typically the only time that we have a quorum is at a conference. And so we are trying to move forward with a more virtual solution for that would allow people to vote, and for us to gain a quorum in the vote by means other than having them in person at a meeting. So if we can get this first president-elect bylaw through, then that would give us the pathway for getting additional bylaws updated and changed, so that those that document can become much more of a living document, and that we have an easier way of changing it. So.
Sounds good to me. So we have a question about a guy who has a IHO Cat A hydrography degree from 1984, and he has not worked in hydrographic surveying since 1988, but seismic surveying. Is there time or restrictions on experience dating that far back?
Yeah, that's, I don't, we certainly look at that in evaluation. So when the board evaluates experience, so certainly some relevance to that of what current experience there is important. But I guess it's on a case-by-case basis, and the board kind of evaluates overall what the person's experience is, and certainly having more relevant experiences and current experiences is important, right? And the quality of the experience, right? So having a long history, you might have the same experience for the last 20 years, but you might have a broader experience over a shorter period. But I think that also touches on where things are going in terms of what we're trying to pursue on the new programs, is having a logbook and starting to track a logbook, because IHO.
Ooh.
So it looks like we've got a couple of questions of what is NOAA's role in the licensing. So both from looks like Karen Hart and Andrew Resnick. And so we NOAA do not have any requirements for licensing in our A&E contracts. And so really this comes down to how anybody who is practicing, practicing hydrography, how do they do that anywhere within the country? And typically that licensing is managed by the states. So NOAA doesn't have that. Now, if we were to pursue a national license, which the boards have discussed, and John can weigh in and talk about that a little bit, then there would need to be some national organization that would do that. That would require there to be some sort of legislation that would give NOAA that authority to oversee and manage that licensing. That is not currently in our authorization to do that, and so that would need to be a legislative change that would happen. So currently, however, all of that is handled at the states, and this has been really more of an issue of making sure that people with hydrographic experience and hydrographic skill have the ability to exercise their ability to practice that that profession and have the appropriate license to do so. And right now that ability does not exist, and so that's where both THSOA and the NSPS Hydrographer Certification Board have been working to open that avenue of possibility for professionals who practice that. So I'm not sure that entirely answers that question, but I don't know, John, if you have anything to add.
Yeah, I can touch on that a little bit. There had been some discussion of could there be some kind of national licensure? It just becomes problematic. You would need an agency to regulate that. So the only equivalent really is FAA and pilot licensure, which is on a national level. But it's an agency that has, statutes and laws that, you can yank a license, and they have the authority to pull a license if they need to. The problem is most of that in any kind of professional licensure is all done on a state level and state licensing boards, and they have the statutes and everything to do that. So that's been looked at quite a bit. It would be pretty difficult to enact for hydrography, especially since a lot of this is in state legislature already. Even if you had a nice national licensure, a state licensing board may not accept it. But as Rick said, you would need some agency that would have the capacity and the authority to yank licensure, look at bad practice. All of that is a requirement. In fact, I think even in our IHO, a little bit there has to be a little more teeth to the program to make sure people are following ethical standards and conducting surveys appropriately. So it's more likely, and that's kind of where we got more aligned with NCEES and the hope of this modular license, that if at least it's a national standard test, each individual state will have to accept that, but it would make it easier for what they call mobility, is to easily get a license in another state. So for example, I'm an engineer, and it's pretty easy to go state to state. You just have NCEES keeps all of the records and your transcripts and everything, and you just fill out an application. So for an engineering license, through Comedy, you can get your license in another state. For surveying, you have to take specific boundary laws and know the public land survey system for that state, and have to take exams right now in most states to get a license in another state. So hopefully this modular exam would make that easier. You wouldn't have to take an exam, you just submit an application.
Nice.
So we're coming up on our time window here, and I want to be cognizant of that. So we've got looks like we've got just a couple more questions, and so at least for Melissa Wood, I'd like to say that yes, we're working with our conference planning vendor to get the US Hydro 2021 website up, and as soon as we have that established, you'll be able to register. And as far as Kevin's question about who's practicing hydrography if you have unmanned systems, well, I think you still need a sentient human being to program those and download their data and process their data. So I don't see us, I don't see the takeover of the robots occurring anytime soon in hydrography. So sorry, I hope that's not too flippant of an answer, Kevin. I appreciate it, but I think there's still plenty of work for us humans in hydrography there. So anyways, I appreciate everyone's participation today and calling in. I hope this was helpful and valuable for you and gives you some indication of where the Hydrographic Society is going over the next year or two. And if we can, let's see, I'll put my, I can put the next slide up there. Then we'll, that has my email address. If you have any questions, please feel free to reach out to me and I'd be happy to try and do my best to answer them. And if I don't know the answer, I will find it for you. So at this point, I think that's going to end today's webinar. Again, I appreciate everyone for calling in and spending some of your time with us. And I'd also like to thank the board and Haley and Jill Stoddard and Starla for helping me run the program behind the scenes here, and for John Dassler and Andy Meacham for taking their time to give us presentations today. So thank you to all of you, and I hope you have a good rest of your week. So thank you very much.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.
Thank you very much, Rick. Thank you to the rest of you guys for very slick, very impressive.
Great. Thank you, Andy.
Appreciate it. Have a good rest of the day. I'm going to sign off right now.
Great. Thank you. Have a good day, all.
Thanks.